Welcome to the EarthWorks Podcast, where our team will share the jargon of carbon from many of our turf friends from the past 30 years.
Hi, everybody. This is Joel Simmons, and I am here with Kevin Hicks and Lawrence Mayhew of the EarthWorks team. And we're going to continue from the series that Kevin started last week, where he had a chance to interview our agronomist, Bill McKibben. And Kevin and I were talking about it after the fact and love working with Bill, have worked with him, leaned on him. I think, Kevin, you had said this in your podcast, is that you lean on him a lot. We all lean on him here as an agronomy team. And he's just been a wealth of information. If you folks that are listening have not seen Bill's book, certainly The Art of Balancing Soils is a must in anybody's soils library. You can actually find it on our website. Now, we don't make any money on it. It goes directly to the Acres USA, who publishes it, but you can access them directly. And Bill's second book is also there. But the first book is really quite a publication, and it really helps. I use it as a reference on my desk at all times. When I'm stuck on something, I'll pull his book out and I'll just go from there. But Kevin and I started talking, and we are very much believers of the three-legged stool. And Bill is such a master of the chemistry stool leg. We wanted to bring our friend Lawrence Mayhew in and then bring it to the next level, which will be about the biological leg of that three-legged stool. And for those of you who are not familiar with the three-legged stool concept, this three-legged stool talks about chemistry, physics, and biology, and each leg needs to be of equal balance, or the stool simply falls over, doesn't work. So chemistry affects physics, which sets the stage, affects biology. So we know a lot of things start with chemistry, and if we don't have the chemistry right, we can't get physics right, and obviously we can't set the stage for biology. So what we're trying to do is really start the process by talking about chemistry, and then we work our way through physics, which I think Bill did quite nicely with your interview last week, Kevin. And then today we thought we'd bring in our big gun on both chemistry and biology, Mr. Lawrence Mayhew, who many of you have heard many times here on the podcast. And Lawrence, without trying to feed your head, you are one of the most popular podcasts in the EarthWorks podcast series. And yeah, exactly. So
yeah, and I think one thing I want to say too is that regardless of whether I'm talking to Lawrence or Bill, I always seem to leave our conversations, whether it's a Monday morning conference call or whatever it might be, I always seem to leave our conversations with more questions than answers, which is why this part 2 is coming up, because we had a great conversation, and as we were talking, it just seemed like we needed to kind of expand upon what Bill and I covered. So I'm excited about this.
Welcome to science.
Yes,
exactly right.
Mad science. So, I mean, the real passion here for those of us at EarthWorks is really ultimately soil biology. I mean, that's really why we're here. Jerry Brunetti was a soil biologist and many other things, but he really instilled the passion in me on the value of soil biology, and that's clearly what we've been focused on. And that's, the EarthWorks product line is really designed to feed the microbial population. But I want to get into it from, again, focusing from the chemistry standpoint and the conversation that you had with Bill last week. And as we were talking about this, there's a lot of questions that came up. Like you said, every time we have these conversations, I've got a laundry list of questions that come out of it. I'm just sitting there scribbling notes and trying to listen, and get, what the hell was he talking about? I didn't know that. I mean, and much like talking to Lawrence, much like it was always when I was talking to Jerry, and I've said this on the podcast 1,000 times, I think, I spent 30 years working in an office with Jerry Brunetti, and till his dying day, there was, he was teaching me something, and it kind of pissed me off, I think, after a while. But I have the same problem with Lawrence. I have the same problem with Bill. I talk to these guys on a fairly regular basis, and I'm always learning something. But I think that's the glory of what we're the position that we're in, Kevin, is that, we've surrounded ourselves with people a lot smarter than us, and we just keep learning. And I think our team really likes that. So having said all of that, so Bill really set the stage for soil chemistry. And Kevin, I think you can take this the next step further, but kind of highlight some of the things that you guys had talked about last week, so that we can springboard Lawrence off to a couple of the other notes. And there you go with your notes again. Yeah, pull your notepad out, because there's a whole laundry list of questions there.
Well, yeah, and honestly, I always write up a little outline, and my desk is such a mess because I was trying to run out of here and take some vacation time. But I'll find it here in just a second.
But Delta wouldn't let you do that. I heard
no, Delta decided I needed to stay home instead of
Delta Airlines said no, Kevin, you don't get a vacation this week. You have to stay home.
Yeah, that was unfortunate.
Welcome to the world of travel.
But no, it just kind of was born out of anytime I'm going over soil tests with somebody or looking through them, I'm invariably hit with questions, and I always keep a running tab of questions for Bill. Just things that I run across on soil tests that don't make sense to me, or I don't know how to relate the interactions between different nutrients on the tests, and so it was probably 6 or 8 months worth of accumulation of Bill questions that just finally said, I gotta get you on. If I've got those questions, I guarantee everybody else does. So that's kind of how it started. But just some of the interactions, I think, and especially with his expertise on the paste extract, those were the things that I really wanted to talk about: the relationships versus the hard numbers. What's more important? What do we focus on? And obviously, in our work, a lot of it is the relationship between potassium and sodium. But I think in our sand-based systems, a lot of times we can't achieve what Bill might consider to be ideal ranges because the CECs are low. There's not a lot of biological activity. In a lot of cases, we're pounding, certainly in the Western US where I am, we're pounding substandard irrigation water over it in mass quantities. And so we're constantly going backwards. It's like that old graphic of the math problem. If a guy climbs 2 rungs of a ladder out of a hole and drops down one every night, how long does it take him to get out of the hole? You ain't getting out of that hole.
There's no hole to get out of. Yeah.
Yeah. So those were the questions that I had in general, but I think there were a couple that you kind of keyed in on when you reviewed it that we wanted to talk about today.
Yeah, so let's start with the one that I think really got me more than anything, and we've talked about it a lot on the podcast and in our turf talks, but let's talk about sodium. I mean, clearly Bill addressed, the fact that sodium is a huge cation. He talked about how soluble it is, and he talked about how it affects soil physics, and he made the point that in our world with sand-constructed soils, a lot of them in the greens and teas, the physics is really not an issue. But that's where he stopped. And again, I mean this with zero criticism because I have the utmost of respect for Bill. But Lawrence, that's why I wanted to take it to this next level. Sodium affects physics, obviously. And that's, again, going back to the three-legged stool. We're talking chemistry affecting physics. But talk about how sodium affects soil biology. I mean, that's really why we wanted to have you join us today. Is let's get into the biological leg of the three-legged stool and get into it. And sodium is a huge problem, as Kevin said, especially west of the Mississippi. Most of our clients' waters are crap, high in sodium, high in bicarbonates, and it definitely affects soil biology. And we've kind of proven that by enhancing soil biology with carbon-based fertilizers, and we see a huge change. But what's the basic chemistry, physics, biology of sodium and microbes?
High blood pressure.
I knew you would have the right answer, just like that.
Interesting.
And that's why you're here. Okay, thank you everybody for joining us today. No, I've used that phrase a lot. I think I stole that.
When you were talking about the effects of sodium on biology, I thought first about how does it impact human beings, and we can measure the impact of high sodium in our blood level, and one of the indicators is high blood pressure. You're always advised to lower your sodium intake. That just shows how sodium has a particularly strong effect on biology in general. So why would it impact a human being? Because we're throwing our mineral balance off inside our body. We have too much sodium relative usually to potassium and calcium and magnesium. And when that gets out of balance and so there's too much sodium relative to those other minerals, that's when we can actually measure it in human beings as high blood pressure. So we know what to do. Plants, that's a little different because how do you measure whether the plant is healthy or not? You can't put a blood pressure sphygmomanometer on a blade of glass. So where are we with that? It's observation and experience. And if you have a lot of experience with high sodic soils, then you probably have a number of ways of trying to combat that. One way is to raise the soluble or bioavailable level of calcium. Same would be applicable to human beings. We try to raise our other minerals to balance off the sodium. The biology is complex to say the least, but it does impact enzymatic activity. And that's just one of many, many things that it impacts. It slows down root growth. Calcium is extremely important to root growth, and sodium would interfere with that just because it's chemistry. This chemistry of sodium is like that. Sodium is very, very active in terms of chemistry activity or physics, which means that when it gets out of balance, the other calcium, let's say boron, sulfur, calcium, magnesium, phosphorus begin to struggle in the uptake end of things and then utilization. So it's interesting that Bill picked on sodium because it's a good example of how saturated paste and sodium in soils do correlate very well. But the amount of sodium that's taken up by plants when they're in a high sodium condition is not well correlated. It's on the Pearson scale, it's a 0.519, which means that's not a strong correlation. There is some correlation between how much sodium there is in a soil and how much is taken up by a plant. And if you plug in, for you statisticians out there, the R squared of that Pearson N would be 27%, which means when you have a high amount of sodium in a soil relative to everything else, we can account for only 27% of its uptake through straight chemistry. So how is the
uptake
rest
of the sodium?
Yes. Yeah, we can only account for 27% of that. So obviously there's something going on there besides straight chemistry. On the opposite end of this saturated paste and correlation to tissue uptake is potassium. Very, very poor correlations. The amount of potassium that's in the soil does not even begin to correlate to the amount of potassium that's taken up by plants. So there's an indicator that there's a different mechanism operating there. If you're getting any potassium uptake at all in a plant, it's not coming from chemistry whatsoever. The reason for that is because potassium, unlike everything else we talked about, it becomes part of the mineral complex of soils, which means it actually integrates within the mineral system of soils, making it extremely difficult to go into solution, i.e. transferring into plant stem. So potassium relies plants rely very, very heavily on actually biological activity to take up potassium.
Explain that a little. I mean, you're talking about now microbial interaction with the potassium, as opposed to strictly a chemical transfer of element from
a mass flow sort of situation.
Right?
Yeah.
So are you suggesting that potassium, for the most part, is not reacting the same way as other elements, and it's more of a bioreaction?
If we put potassium sulfate into a soil, two things happen. Number one, the sulfate disrupts the soil system chemically, not even to mention the biology. And then the potassium has to go somewhere, and it actually combines with the mineral structure of the soil minerals that are ubiquitous in soils. So then there is no easy chemical solution to this problem. So that potassium has to be released because now it's buried deep in a mineral complex, has to be released by microorganisms.
You know,
do we have the head exploding thing?
Yeah,
the emoji?
Where is that emoji when you need it? You know,
Well,
and it's funny because Bill was talking about that relationship, but didn't get
yeah.
into its bio-release pattern, and and again,
Mhm.
it goes back to we all kind of understand that this potassium sodium ratio exists, but
Right.
again, talk about the chemistry of sodium. It's moving through the cell wall, and once
Mhm.
it's in that cell, what's physically happening?
Like any other element that the plant takes in, it needs to combine with something in the plant tissues, or actually in the cytoplasm of these plants,
Yeah.
as some kind of compound. So if I had a piece of pure potassium or sodium in my hand, it would burn right through my hand as soon as the moisture in the air touched it. So there's no pure sodium in there.
Yeah.
It has
Yeah.
to combine. Usually it'll combine with another organic compound instead of an inorganic compound. In other words, it'll be sought out and bound by carbon-based compounds, and that stabilizes it within the plant.
So what's an example of a carbon-based compound intracellularly?
Typically for calcium, let's say it's an oxalate,
Okay. So it's
calcium
still another,
oxalate.
yeah. I mean, one of the things that, we hear a lot from golf course superintendents,
Mm.
sports turf managers is, they see wilting happening, and they
Wilting.
test, they test the water, or excuse me, they feel the soil and it's moist. And what they're dealing with, in our understanding, and you can certainly correct me if I'm wrong, is instead of an environmental wilt because of lack of water,
Mhm.
it's a chemical wilt, and they do an EC meter, or they run a soil test, see a paste extract, see very high levels of sodium. And
Mhm.
so, we refer to this as sodium-induced wilt. And again, help us better understand the biology, the physics of this. But I assume what's happening, and that goes back to what you were saying with high blood pressure. You're getting this high blood pressure because the sodium is now kind of drawing mineral out of the cell, and again, what we're seeing is wilting. And a lot of times, a superintendent will look at that and say, well, why are we wilting? I got plenty of moisture, I've been irrigating. But it's the chemistry that's doing this.
In addition to chemistry, the plant cell would need some water
A
to,
lot of water, but
yeah.
especially if the water is loaded with sodium, then it's, I mean,
Mhm.
that's the battle a lot of our guys are dealing with, is that their water is the problem and it's
Mhm.
loaded with sodium. So they put more and more on, and they're actually adding a lot more sodium. So
They
it's
would
almost a
be.
defeated purpose.
Yes, they would be. Um, that's where the nutrient balance that Bill refers to a lot. That's the name of his book,
Yeah,
Balancing. Balance. That's where that comes in pretty handy. Um, in order to balance, let's say, a sodium excess of sodium, you can pick just about anything. You can pick calcium, you can pick potassium, calcium, anything that's closely related to that, like potassium, calcium. I would start looking at some micronutrients, but I don't think they would handle it very well. So trying to maintain that balance is part of the cell's job. So if there's
right.
too much sodium, it has to eject sodium, and the only way it's going to eject it is is going out the tissue leaves. And if there's more sodium sitting out there, you have
Mm-hmm.
this imbalance even at that surface, because sodium moves by, let's call it osmosis, where it would move from a high concentration to a low concentration. So if you put pure water on the leaf, yeah, the sodium will move from a high concentration to a low
Yeah.
concentration. Yeah, that would
Basic
work.
basic chemistry, right?
Basic, yeah.
Yeah.
Pretty
10th
So it's a
grade
basic.
chemistry.
more of a dilution concept than it is a, a removal. Is that am I understanding what you're saying correctly?
Yeah, the solution to pollution is dilution,
Is
right?
dilution.
I was just going to say
So
that.
I want to back up just for a second, because I'm stuck on this.
Okay.
And maybe this is the wrong way to say it, but am I understanding the way you describe this, that in the world of chemistry, that sodium would be considered an easier element to take up than potassium in a plant? Let's just use it in general terms. And it also sounded as if, this is where I'm not sure that the definition is correct, as if sodium is more of a novel uptake, whereas potassium is a fairly complex one that pulls soil biology into the conversation. Is that a good way to look at it?
Yeah, I think you're pretty close on that.
I'll take pretty close.
Yeah, okay.
Any day.
Feel
In
pretty good
chemistry.
about that.
When I threw that correlation of soil sodium content versus how much ends up in tissues, and I said it was a 0.5, that's not bad, really. It's not a great correlation, but it does show that some of that sodium is just simply moving because of the chemistry. Now, that is similar to the way boron and sulfur and calcium and magnesium are taken up in plants. So if you want to talk pure chemistry and you're talking about boron, sodium, calcium, magnesium, and sodium, yeah, we can talk chemistry about those things. But on the opposite end of the spectrum is potassium that I already brought up, but so is zinc, nitrogen, phosphorus, manganese, copper, and iron are on the opposite end of the way they behave. So yeah, sodium is taken up very easily by plants. It moves very, very easily.
Why is that? Is that because it's such a large cation?
It's not really that large, in my opinion. It's very light. It's a very light cation.
Okay, so it's easy, so making it easy to move. Yeah.
Yeah. And
chemistry, being light means what? Less chemical reaction? What's that chemically?
Very, very low density.
Okay.
Yeah, it's very easy to move around, actually. Its chemistry is one of solubility. Wherever you see sodium associated with another anion, they're usually pretty soluble. Look at sodium sulfate, for example. Yeah. Sodium compounds are generally very soluble. It's just their chemistry. They only have one positive charge on the molecules. So it makes for, it doesn't interfere with a lot of things. A lot of things don't interfere with it. So it's quite mobile, especially in the environment.
And when you have so much of it in your irrigation water and you're just constantly introducing, and we talk about this a lot. I mean, where we really see the biggest problems, and I think a lot of guys get busy and they don't think about this. It gets hot, it gets dry, their irrigation usage goes up exponentially, and so does the sodium introduction. You know, and that's when it comes, back to really having to try to figure out a way to take care of this. I don't want this to sound self-serving, but it's going to. But one of the rising stars in our product line is the product.
I was just going to ask about this.
You and I worked on very closely, the KVantage, and you and I worked on it, for quite a while before you kind of got it really dialed in. And I'll tell you, it has, and I think we've shared this with you, but out in the field, the response that we're getting from superintendents, especially this time of year, has been unbelievable. I mean, and I think
Wow.
it is definitely, I think it's definitely providing that sodium buffer that you and I had talked about for so long. We were trying to find ways to buffer sodium, and we've been using potassium. We could flush sodium out, but if you don't replace the potassium, it just goes right back. I mean, I use the analogy of musical chairs. When the music stops, everybody sits down, but when the music, and picks up again, and they just, there's so much sodium there that they're going to just grab all those chairs. What's happening with that? I mean, what did you do with that formula that, and I think what, you and I have talked about this, but I think what we're seeing is potassium actually getting into the plant because we're bringing to the table biology, or is it the organic forms of potassium? I mean, what's helping this product do what it's doing apparently so incredibly well?
The first thing I wanted to do in developing that product was completely avoid sulfates and chlorides. So
and you did.
There's no potassium sulfate in it. There's no potassium chloride in it. Why? Because they interfere with the uptake of potassium. The number one fertilizer out there in agriculture for potassium is potassium chloride. There's also papers published on this called the potassium paradox. The more potassium chloride you put on, the less potassium is taken up by the plant. And the mechanism responsible for that is the chloride. The chloride is interfering with the uptake and utilization of the potassium. So that's, in my book, that's out. We're not ever going to even think about potassium chloride. Sulfates are very disruptive to the, how would I put this, the structural and energy transfer and mechanisms within the molecule called water. It's very, very disruptive to water. It's astonishing the amount of sulfates we use in light of the fact that water is horribly disturbed as a molecule, as an entity.
Explain that by disturbed. What's it doing? It's changing structurally?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Water molecules have a certain stability, and that's how they can exist. You throw a sulfate in there, and the structure of the molecule begins to change. Yeah. And then it's no longer water as nature recognizes it. So those were the things I looked at initially. Now, the big challenge was, what will a plant take up in forms of calcium or potassium? And what can we put into the soil as a potassium input that's not going to head right for those minerals and get locked up, just like the chlorides do and the sulfides do? So I ended up with potassium acetate as the primary ingredient. That means that it is a form of potassium that is actually bound to a carbon structure. It's almost like a chelate rather than a chemistry. It has the chemistry of chelation rather than the chemistry of anion and cation. Anions and cations are obviously fighting each other, and each one wants the territory. So that was starters. The other thing was potassium formate. Again, this is a organic molecule. The third ingredient is potassium carbonate. Naturally occurs in nature. It's very, very low solubility. So there's not very much in there, but it still complements the organic aspects of the other two ingredients. So what we're doing is we're trying not to disrupt the energy of the water system. We're trying not to disrupt the chemistry of the plant. Then there's solid evidence, research evidence, that those three forms of potassium are taken in quicker, better, faster than anything else that's out there. And chlorides and sulfates are barely able to move across the plant membrane at all.
But the uptake is because of the
sodium. That sounds like a good place to start.
Yeah. So what you're kind of describing is a sum that's greater than the parts, because
synergistic effects.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we call that eco-adaptive in our world, but it's making that small amount. I mean, we're applying ounces per 1,000 square feet. That small amount is considerably more effective in uptake than should be, like you said, like a potassium chloride would be,
or potassium
which sulfate, is ineffective,
which
and
is
you can't fight
pounds. Yeah, that's in a pounds per 1,000.
You can't even fight it. The more you put on, the less is taken up. The literature is clear on that.
Yeah,
everybody should know that. Why don't they know that?
Yeah, maybe so, Lawrence, but I'll guarantee that I didn't.
Somebody, I think Jerry told me this, but potassium chloride is chlorine at a rate 10 times higher than we chlorinate water. And why do we chlorinate water? To kill things?
Kill biology.
Potassium chloride is 42% chloride. That's a major hit.
So what does that do to soil biology? I mean, that's really where we're trying to go.
It just kills it.
Yeah,
and
it's a toxin.
Question, why we use it?
What's that stuff they use? What's the chemical they use when they want to inject a prisoner who's on death row?
Is it potassium chloride?
Potassium chloride.
Yeah.
Lovely.
Wow, I never heard that one. I'm going to use that.
Yeah, look it up.
My next academy.
Look it up.
So now we've gone and we've forayed into turfinasia, I guess.
Turfinasia, exactly. I like that. Yeah,
yeah.
It's the Last Supper for turf. Is that what?
So why do we use? Maybe more in agriculture, but why do we? And I know the answer. It's a leading question. Why do we use potassium chloride?
Cheap.
Cheap. And
there's a potassium guarantee on it. There should be a chloride guarantee, but there's a potassium guarantee on it.
What's the percentage of potassium versus chloride? I mean, 40% chloride and how much potassium?
60, right?
Roughly 60.
60.
Yeah, that's by weight. That's by weight. But chemists rarely use weight. Chemists use moles, MOLES. So on a molecular basis, it's 1 to 1. For every mole of chloride, you have 1 mole of potassium. Problem is, potassium is very lightweight. Chlorine's a heavyweight, literally on an atomic basis. So thus we get the disruption in all kinds of water and soil systems.
So if there's one takeaway from this, it's avoid potassium chloride if at all possible.
Yeah, which is really sad because potassium is very critical to osmotic pressure within cells. And we've probably all been trained in that respect. So how do you get some potassium in there became the question. This goes back to roughly 20, 30 years ago when John Kemp asked me the same question. He said, I need a potassium product for hoop houses, for which never get rained on. And then they see buildup of chlorides in these hoop houses because they never gets leached out. And it started then, and I've been researching it ever since. And finally got to apply it to a product.
You see that a lot in cannabis, in any greenhouse production. I mean, they're using and Bill talked about this very eloquently last week, and in that, these are all soluble salts, and in an enclosed environment like that, and especially with man-made soil, you have these salts just build up because you're not really flushing anything out. You don't have Mother Nature to flush out for sure. And the water is usually is rich in these minerals, and sodium is one of the big ones. And I would assume even in a constructed soil like a potting mix, potassium would be hard to move into the plant. Would that be a fair statement?
Yeah, and these hoop buildings also suffer from a buildup of sulfur from sulfates, and they have a buildup of boron from borates. The chemistry of these three are very similar in that they will flush out under normal conditions. Normal rainfall flushes these things through natural systems. So take away the rainfall and
so we're right to be thinking that having potassium in the program where sodium is a problem will help to keep will help to keep the sodium out of the cell and protect the cell from this sodium-induced wilt stress, or this wilting problem.
Right. And I've worked out the molar balances for that.
Of course you did.
Yes.
Well, I helped him, but
of course you did.
Yeah. So in a natural soil system, what really struck me when I started doing the research of what's in a natural soil solution that's unfertilized, it turns out that there's 1 millimole of calcium in a typical soil solution, which makes it really easy because it's one. And then everything else you can just balance against it and look at. It's really easy to calculate. So it worked out rather fun.
You keep using this natural. I mean, I think this is the definition of what you coined as eco-adaptive. Is what you're really doing is you studied natural systems, and that's where again, not to pat ourselves on the back, but KVantage was a great example, and that was really one of your first truly eco-adaptive products. But you studied the natural system, and that's where you went away from the chlorides and the sulfates, and you went to carbon-based sources of potassium that were obviously in our case, doused with all sorts of foods that help stimulate the microbial population. But this is really what you were focused on, is getting to that balance of nature, what Mother Nature would actually do in a proper environment, which I think is pretty interesting. And obviously it seems to be working. I mean, talk about, in this product, not only are we providing the minerals, but we're providing an awful lot of food substance to stimulate microbial. What's the reaction now when we have these forms of potassium hitting the soil and we've stimulated a population of microbes with these food sources that were used to, promote activity? What's the relationship that's happening now between the microbe and the mineral that you've put into the, I think I just stumped him. He's
I think
one cool.
There's smoke coming out of his ears. I don't know what's going on.
Yeah, that's one thing when it's not rehearsed.
Never
might have to think first before I start moving my mouth.
I thought you had it all right here on the top of your head.
It reminded me of walking into a place that has a smorgasbord cafe.
Oh.
you took me there the first day I met you, if you remember, right?
I
You
don't, but
walk,
go ahead.
you walk up to a buffet, and what if the buffet was loaded with broccoli and nothing else?
Oh,
Yeah.
yum.
Are you going to make money? You
Yeah.
know? Are people going to go away happy? I don't think so. If it was overloaded with chicken and no beef, you would have customers turning away. Why? Because customers want variety. Microbes want variety. Plants want variety. Plants and microbes are genetically driven to pick whatever it is they need. The genes are there, the proteins are there, the enzymes are there, and it's all a huge energy and genetic commitment on the part of plants and microbes to pick and choose what they want. So we have very little control over that. The moron, poor moron if they need more of this. Right. That'd be like taking that smorgasbord and putting one thing there for people to pick. That is not natural.
Just don't make it broccoli.
Okay. I thought I'd pick on that one because a lot of people don't like broccoli.
Yeah, exactly. I happen to love broccoli, but
I happen to.
I love that analogy, and I'm going to be stealing that for if anybody's listening, you'll see that probably in my next academy. That's a brilliant analogy because that's really what we're trying to say in the diversity. I mean, this is what Jerry started with, and you and I have certainly continued, is the diversity of foodstuffs designed to feed a broad spectrum of microbes in the soil, but it's not just one. I mean, a lot of, especially liquid fertilizers in our industry, but even granular fertilizers, it's three things. It's NP and K, and very limited in its scope and not really doing anything for feeding microbes,
and associated with the wrong chemistry. So when you said you wanted a potassium product, right away I'm thinking minimum of 3 ingredients that provide 3 different forms of potassium, because that's the way it is in natural conditions. There's just not one potassium compound out there. There's many, many, many potassium compounds.
Yeah. And
pick anything, and that's true. Pick any element, that's true.
Talk about let's kind of change direction a little bit, because one of the things that came out of the conversation that Kevin had with Bill, again, really good focus on soil chemistry, but that's where it stopped. Things that affect the plant. I mean, it can't just be these elements. It has to bring, as Jerry would say, microbes eat at the table first. Let me have you kind of go down that road a little bit, because if we're talking about the three-legged stool, chemistry obviously sets the table, but it's the biology that does all the feasting. And I think we forget that as an industry. Academia certainly forgets that. I mean, the whole concept of balancing the soil has been poo-pooed. In fact, I think Bill's book was why I hit the hit list for our friend Travis's BS turf thing, because he didn't like the concept of the art of balancing soils. But that's really what it's all about. It's really all about a balance in a very big and very general term. I mean, not only balancing the nutrients, but balancing the buffet so that we don't just have broccoli, and the biological piece of this.
My big question is, how do you define balance?
Good question.
And I'm a product developer. And if someone approaches me and says, "Hey, I've got this volcanic ash sitting in somewhere, and I think you should buy it because it's the best thing in the whole world since sliced bread." If you don't believe in your product, you don't believe it's the best thing on the face of the earth, you better be doing something else. So they're all
Why is sliced bread the best thing in the world? I never understood that. I just don't get that.
I don't know.
Have you ever try to eat it when it's not sliced?
I can slice it. I have a knife.
Teeth before teeth were welded
Anyway,
up.
I interrupted you. I'm sorry.
I put together a database of the elemental composition of soils globally. So I can take one look at my little database. It's huge, actually. And then look at ratios. What is the ratio of carbon or calcium to magnesium, for example? Because you hear 3 to 1, 4 to 1, 5 to 1. You hear all kinds of examples. Well, that depends on how it's analyzed.
Yeah, sure.
So the same analysis we use, aqua regia extraction of soils, So the same extraction method was used. Then I built the database, and there's outliers, and there's, they're all over the place. But I look at those ratios if I'm going to develop a product. So if this ash or whatever it is they're trying to sell me has a real high content of this, it better have a high content of something else to balance that off that matches what's in the database. Otherwise, I call it enriched in something. I'm always looking for something enriched in silicon, and that's really, really difficult. That's a tough one right there. Haven't found that magic.
Well, sand, but you're not getting the silicon out of it.
No, we're not. No.
Yeah.
No, we're not getting the silicic acid out of it.
Silicic acid, right?
We're only getting sand. So
Yeah.
that's one way I look at balance. Then working for you with your liquid products, what do we balance this and that against also? So I tried it. For example, you have a magnesium product, but I put calcium in it.
Right.
I don't know if it's even on the
What
label.
the hell are you doing that for? It's a magnesium product.
Because it needs to be balanced with calcium to be effective.
Balanced.
You just can't stick magnesium out there as a magnesium product and say you're done. That's not the way things work. Magnesium does horrible in the absence of calcium. They are synergistic if they're in the right balance. So how do I define that balance? I look at that database that shows what's in natural soil solutions, and then that's where I determine the concentration in a product. So there's nothing works by itself. Yeah. Everything works synergistically with something, and everything is pretty much antagonized by everything else. Yeah. So if you have too much cobalt in there, it's going to antagonize the molybdenum. Too much molybdenum, it's going to antagonize the cobalt. So, yeah, defining balance is a bit tricky.
Yeah, and that's your definition of eco-adaptive right there. You just described that pretty perfectly.
I did.
Yeah. Really having that whole thing. One of the things that Bill talked about, and again, I mean no criticism by any chance, because obviously he's brilliant. But one of the things that you when you're talking to a pure chemistry guy in soils, you can't change the soil chemistry. I've heard this many times. Well, you can't change the soil, but what we can do is start to introduce the biological piece. And when we start to do this on these rich mineral soils, and this is, a relatively new phenomenon. I mean, we've been doing it obviously for over 30 years, but it's certainly taken off in a big way recently. Is the concept of carbon introduced into a fertility program. We're seeing huge changes. We're seeing buffers that never buffered before. I mean, these might be really high sodium soils or high bicarbonate or high pH soils or really high salt soils. But when we start to bring into the picture this whole biological piece, this whole carbon piece, things are changing, and it's changing. I don't want to say in the absence of, but in the presence of some of these really imbalanced soils. Does that help me understand that a little bit better from a biological standpoint?
Specifically with humic substances, I think, right?
Well, that certainly is a big player, right?
Yeah. I just had a conversation with a golf course superintendent in Reno that he started incorporating some of that and some of our materials into his program. And even though he's got a really poor water quality issue, he said that the effects of that have become a lot less concerning over the course of the last year. So there's something else going on, and
we're buffering, right?
Yeah.
We're doing some
what
buffering.
it is, Lawrence.
Well, a turning point for me was a paper published by Larry Phelan at the Ohio State University, and he brought up this term called biological buffering, which I had never heard of that before. His point was minerals and particularly micronutrients, when they're out of balance, can really cause a lot of trouble with plant growth, health. The ability of a plant to ward off disease, for example, is negatively impacted when there are imbalances. And his data showed where you introduce biology into these systems, and these charts he made were absolutely beautiful. They were 3D charts. He showed where there's like this sweet spot. You got so much boron here, you got so much zinc there, so much copper here, and there's this sweet spot, which we would call balance, perhaps. And he showed that if you had a system that was right in that spot, which would kind of define the way biology determined those numbers, not inputs, but biology determined those numbers. He called it biological buffering. And in the presence of humic substances that are renowned for removing what's called entropy in thermodynamic terms, which means they settle things down, the combination of balancing nutrients and introducing humic substances, which are naturally occurring, by the way.
Yeah.
That's how the system works. It detoxifies, it balances nutrients. It does so many things that when the snake oil salesman came through Wisconsin 60 years ago, they were telling the truth, but they were selling coal.
Right. They were selling the wrong problem or the wrong product, but they were telling the right story.
So when I started studying humic substances, I would do a double takedown on the Steenbach Library stacks. I would be reading these fascinating books on humic substances. And I'd just shake my head and I'd check the book out and take it home to see if I could understand it, because it defies our conventional chemistry teaching. They totally fly in the face of that.
But this is not anything new. I mean, these are natural systems that have been working since the birth of the earth.
Dark soils are more productive, right?
Yeah.
Sure.
Lighter soils in color are less productive. Well, what's the darkness of dark soils?
Something called humic something
like that. Yeah.
Something like that. Yeah.
There could be some char in there, but
maybe, but it's still
not
very
a lot.
similar structural.
Not a lot. Yeah. These things are renowned for doing their own balancing act. Just put them out there.
Who was the researcher that did this at Ohio State?
Larry Phelan, Phelan. And I don't recall. I grabbed the term out of there called biological balancing, but let me.
How old is that? How old does that work?
Oh gosh, that has to go back to the 90s.
Okay, so it's not new, and this has been something that has been poo-pooed and grit. I mean, when Jerry and I got into this thing, we were called every name in the book, and you guys started the HPTA because there were so many snake oil salesmen selling coal dust as opposed to truly humates. But these concepts have been around for a long time. I love the phrase biological buffering. I'm going to use that as well because I think it explains the purpose of why we're here today is that, we can talk soil chemistry, and it's incredibly important. If we can't get the soil chemistry right, we can't change the soil physically. We can't set the table for biology. But it's got to be a three-legged stool. It's got to work, in harmony. And this biological buffering concept, I think, and especially where I think it's really of value is that in our soils in the golf course industry and the sports different, we're making up fake soils. We're building soils out of sand. This is not how Mother Nature did it. So the whole system is thrown off a kilter by nature of what we've done, but we can bring a lot of it back to Mother Nature by biological buffering and bringing carbon to the table. And I think that's what you're seeing in our industry now with, everybody and their sister coming out with something that's, organic or carbon based, but it's about this buffering process, right?
Yes.
And
I
Kevin,
should send you the reference. It's 2004. Connecting the below ground and above ground food webs, the role of organic matter in biological buffering.
Oh, that's a bunch of crap. That doesn't work.
Yeah, published by the CRC Plus press. Yeah.
And Kevin, you've seen this. I mean, you superintendent for 25 years, and you were, you understood this better than anybody I knew back in the day. And, you've seen it firsthand. Again, you're dealing in crappy soils, crappy water. And the only real way to get around that, you're not going to change the soil, right? You dealt with it your whole career.
Right. Right. Well, and Bill talked about water specifically with respect to sodium. He said, you want to flush sodium out of the system. Well, if you're using a high sodium water, that's your new baseline, is whatever that's going to be. But you can balance chemistry to the point where the physics really do change. I mean, it's not, you're not going to send it through a sieve and have it be something different, but it performs differently.
Lawrence, let me ask you this. What affects physics quicker, soil chemistry or soil biology?
quicker? Chemistry.
So by getting the chemistry right, you're going to start to flocculate the soil.
No, by getting the chemistry wrong, it works pretty darn
Oh,
quick.
all right.
Now,
Even
try to
better.
get the chemistry right. You gotta be patient and willing to go open up your pocketbook. Yeah, that's a lot slower. And biology over time. I just came back from a conference sponsored by Acres up in Viroqua, Wisconsin, and presenter after presenter after presenter showed pictures of their soil before and after.
Yeah.
And the only thing different, and that took a while, maybe years, but the point was, if you really treat these soils the way they need to be treated rather than abuse them, they turn around, they become more productive. And it's just amazing to listen to all those presenters and all those success stories that they've actually done it. Now, you do it on a little bit different scale. It's not the same as going out there and
1,000
tilling your
acres.
soil
Yeah.
and planting an annual crop. You got a perennial crop pretty much. But the principles that these folks followed are effective. And if we stick to those principles and we encourage biological activity, the returns are tremendous.
Yeah.
And eventually the change is visible.
Yeah. And our industry is seeing that, and they're realizing that the investment is well worth it, because ultimately that investment pays off in reduction of costs and much better product. I mean, Kevin, you certainly saw that over your career in 3 or 4 different locations in the country. One of the we talk about this a lot, but when we just started working pretty heavily in the state of Florida on on really low CEC soils, and I really thought when we got there that it would be a very slow turnaround time. You'd mentioned it takes a while to build soils, but their soils, their soils are low CECs. There's not a whole lot of organic matter. I really thought we would not be successful because it would be too much upfront cost to get a return on investment. I was dead wrong. I mean, it has been radically different than what I thought. A little bit has gone amazingly long, and I think I was at an academy a week or so back, and one of our partners had been a superintendent in Florida, and he said, "Yeah, I never even heard of EarthWorks," and they weren't doing anything on a carbon base because it tended to be economics over agronomics. But when they started going down that road, and of course, obviously EarthWorks is not the only player in carbon-based fertility. When the industry went down that road, man, it's changed radically. I mean, you can't throw a dead cat without hitting somebody selling you something organic.
And it goes right back to that sum is greater than the parts.
Right.
You're probably coming at it from more angles than we even give it credit because of the complexity of it.
Well, and obviously what we're doing with the diversity of carbon, our buffet is very full. We got a lot more than just broccoli and chicken, and we're feeding a lot of microbes, and it truly is a biological buffering process. And you see how I'm using all these terms I just learned, but it really is a buffering, and that's kind of what I wanted to get at here in this conversation in follow up with Bill. I mean, he set the stage chemically, but without the biological piece, especially in our soils, because they're so void of biology. I mean, your trip, to that tour in Wisconsin was probably on a rich, deep soil. We don't typically have those. We have very poor, soils with bad water, and we also have a tremendous amount of physical pressure on our soils. People walking over them, mowers driving over them, blowers, and just so much physical pressure. And then of course, our industry, is in the position where chemistries are used on a regular basis to prevent diseases. So all of these things are pushing against us from a biological standpoint.
Well,
And the need for
this part of Wisconsin called the driftless area, meaning we got a lot of hills and valleys and potential for erosion, happens to have the highest population density per capita of organic farms than any place on the face of the earth. And we have an organic matter average of about 4% on sandy loam soils.
On sandy loam soils. Why is it so high in organic farms? Any idea?
I think the climate has a lot to do with it because we get sufficient rain historically. So we get good rain, and winters aren't so harsh as to kill everything off. And these growers have learned by balancing calcium, magnesium, and a few other things that they can produce pretty resistant crops that winter over quite well. But it's the
And come back.
climate mostly.
Yeah.
Mhm.
We've all seen the movie Kiss the Ground, and of course it's something I encourage. But Ray Archuleta was really, he went around the country talking about this, and our friend Gabe Brown, who was featured in that, I think that's one
Gabe
of the
Brown,
most
yeah.
one of the most striking. I think we had dinner with Gabe at one of the Acres things. I think you were with us, but maybe not. But Gabe, one of the most striking scenes in that movie was when Gabe was standing on the border between his property and his neighbors. And he's in a semi-arid area of the country, and his soil was rich and dense and lush, and his neighbor's soil looked semi-arid. I mean, and that really, when you see that picture and that profile, you just can't help but to think, wow, that just really drives this whole point home. And he was this close to being out of business until I think Jerry was a part of this conversation with Gabe. Was he started to understand the value of treating his soil a little bit better, and that's all we're trying to say on the golf course side. Treat your soils a little bit better.
Well, and the crazy thing about it, I've got a fellow board member on our soil conservation district for the county that he's a regenerative farmer, and his neighbor, when he went down this path, a guy in his 60s, and he said, I'm going to try something different because what we're doing isn't working. And so he did. And his neighbor looked over his fence and said, you're out of your mind.
Yeah.
And 4 years later, same neighbor, hey, can you manage my property as well?
Can you help me figure that out? Yeah.
And the reality of it is their inputs have dropped dramatically.
They will.
And the cattle
Profit
that they're
margins
grazing
have gone through the roof.
Yeah, and the cattle they're grazing have gotten healthier, and they're, like I said, their inputs have dropped, and yet the yields and the quality has gone up. So
you make a good point.
You can't expect the same thing.
You make a good point about, on a farm system, we don't have cows grazing on our greens, right? But that completes the cycle. And and I've said this many times, but that was one of the most striking things that Jerry taught me was, he'd get called into a farm because the cow was down. And the first thing he would do after he, looked at the cow was look
at the soil
tests. Yeah.
Yeah.
And because it's a complete system. And, we have to take that on faith in the golf course and the sports field and turf. But, that's the kind of feedback that we hear all the time, Kev. We're constantly hearing guys saying, yeah, this, first of all, it makes sense. And secondly, it works. 30 years ago, it was just heresy. And, maybe you have one crazy guy that would say, well, yeah, let me try that. And then, they'd come back and say, wow, let me try some more. And, the loyalty factor has always been extremely strong because the results are there, and it's not, and now we're starting to see it all across the board. And now you're seeing, everybody and their sister coming out with organic something. Which is good. I'm thrilled about it. All boats will rise. And, and that's kind of where we want to go with this, which is really important. I hate to say this, guys, but we've already kind of pushed an hour here.
Okay.
But again, okay, he said.
Part two of 77 in this series.
Yes, exactly. I think we got to do this a little bit better. But again, I just want to stress, what you have done, Lawrence, and in helping us better understanding the biological buffering system, has really been invaluable to us. And we get that feedback a lot from people that listen to you on our podcasts. And, we were talking about this morning, and Mike Small, our marketing guy, says, yeah, you got to get Lawrence back. And we get some of the best numbers from Lawrence. I've got, I told you this, and again, I'm going to feed your head, but we've got guys that, we had a guy that came into our trade show booth who was a competitor. Hey, is Lawrence here? Is Lawrence here? I want to meet Lawrence. But when you have these conversations, and in particular, when we start talking like we have today about soil biology, I think it just resonates to a lot of people now. And look what they're fighting. They're fighting the economics of it all. They're fighting the chemistry of it all. And you know, and I think that the bottom line is that soil biology can buffer biological buffering a lot of the issues that, you know, people in our industry and certainly people in regenerative agriculture have been suffering. I mean, is that a reasonable?
Yes. Yeah.
You know, and Kevin, you broached your, you know, your work on the conservation district. I mean, you know, you and I talk about this all the time. I think it's fascinating that you and this regenerative farmer are starting to bring ideas into what would probably be assumed to be a fairly conventional environment, right?
Yep. We actually have the board surrounded because there's another regenerative farmer on the board that. So there's 3 out of 5 of us that kind of are singing the same tune right now, which is cool.
No chemical salesman? What do you mean? What's going on here?
No.
What's happening there?
There's a former noxious weed employee from the state, but you know, obviously that approach is a totally different one, strictly chemistry and what'll kill something. So
which is,
but even that individual's coming around.
Nice.
Unbelievable.
Good stuff.
Lawrence, thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you for all that you have done. Like I said, you know, again, and I know you and I have talked about this, but I really am excited about what we're seeing with some of these things that you've been helping us with, in particular, KVantage. I mean, getting that, you know, that we started the conversation with sodium and seeing that, you know, I mean, when we had been traditionally a flush program, it was using calcium to break the sodium free. The humates will kind of grab it and keep it from reattaching. And then we're trying to figure out a way to get the potassium in there. And I think that we've been able to do that. And it seems like KVantage is just almost a complete flush program. I mean, I would still want to add some other things to it, but you know, from a soil flushing standpoint in a sand constructed soil like ours typically are, it's been working incredibly well. So if I had a hat, I would be taking it off right now.
Thank you.
But I don't have a hat. Kevin, thank you so much. I think we
thank
need
you,
a part
Lawrence.
3. Lawrence, thank you very much for everything you've done. And I want to thank everybody that's been listening and watching. Please join us next week. I don't know, do we have a part 3, Kev? I don't know if we do. Maybe
I'm telling you, we've got a part 77.
We got, I was going to say there could be 70
again.
Yeah. I mean, there's just so much to it, but you know, one of the things that, you know, and Mike said this morning, Kevin, is that, you know, and Lawrence and Bill both, you just exude this enthusiasm and this, you know, this passion for it. And Jerry, of course, was a master of that as well. But, you know, that's what this is all about, is that it's just, you know, we're doing good things and changing things and helping people be more successful, watching farmers reduce inputs and keep their farms. I mean, it's where it should be. And I've said
pretty rewarding.
Yes. Thank you, everybody.